Join passionate automotive trainer and coach Andrew Uglow as he talks about how you get resourcefulness. He unpacks the organised strategies and tactics that set apart the most resourceful automotive technicians. We kick off with a jaw-dropping tale of 196 fault codes on a single car. I'm your host, Anthony Pearl, and this is the Frictionless Workshop podcast. Let's get cranking. So, Andrew, we're going to do a little bit of a recap at the start of this episode because we've covered a lot of territory already. But I suppose the first thing when we start talking about this formula that you've got for resourcefulness, let's just define again technical resourcefulness.
Yeah, thanks, Anthony. It's interesting that technical resourcefulness is, I think, different from just your typical resourcefulness that you might talk about in a job interview and that sort of stuff. So we define technical resourcefulness as an organised structure of strategies and tactics for reaching, firstly, a valid perception or getting insight into a concern and its root cause, and then applying those insights skillfully and efficiently to rectify the issue or the issues that are involved. So it's put simply in a sentence, it's an organised structure of strategies and tactics for getting a valid insight. Is the first part.
And I think the key is that from what I understand of what you've been talking about, is that we really need to understand that sometimes there are significant problems, and to actually go through one by one and tick things off as what may or may not be possible, it's just going to be a ridiculous amount of time. And I know, and that's, so the whole idea is to be able to cut through some of that. So, but I know you were telling me that there's been a new record for fault codes that you've come across recently. So tell me a little bit about that to give us some context of what people might be dealing with.
So I have a silly hobby of tracking the highest number of fault codes on cars. So I'm talking to technicians day in, day out, and often during either our casual discussion or part of the training, I'll ask the question, well, what's the highest number of fault codes you've ever had on a car? And to put it in context, anything over 100 is insane. It is a crazy number of fault codes. And I had a gentleman in my training just recently, and he said, I had 196. Now that's beaten my previous record of 192. And you go, well, okay, so it's only 4 more. Well, let me try and give some context as to just how huge that number is. So if you were to presuppose that of those 196 fault codes, it would take you about 30 minutes to do the manufacturer's test of each one of those fault codes. And so you multiply 196 by 30, and that gives you the total number of minutes, which is not far from 6,000 minutes. And then you multiply that by the labour rate that the business charges customers. And you're comfortably in the millions of dollars of labour to go and just do the test of all of those codes. So if you weren't sure what to do or where to start, you just thought, well, I'll just start at the beginning and work my way to the end. Like, that's $1 million labour rate. And even if you were to go, well, actually, let's pretend someone does know a little bit about what they're doing. And you said, well, maybe a third of those fault codes are duplicates. Maybe a third of them are what we call, or what I call, sympathy codes. This module set the code and another module set the same code for the same fault because they were both watching the circuit. And you just go, well, we're just going to deal with a third of those. And you do the same math, right? So you multiply about 65 codes by the 30 minutes times your labour rate. I'm still in hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of labour. And like, who's going to pay for that? I've got a $100,000 car, say. I'm not going to pay $350,000 just in labour for someone to find what's wrong with it. And so there has to be a better way of just merely grinding through the data to try and figure out what's going on. And really that's what resourcefulness, and more specifically, what technical resourcefulness is all about. And so I'll explain perhaps when we get to the end of this podcast just what the guy did, because the tech that was working on it was actually one of these really highly resourceful individuals, and his solution and resolution was really quite impressive.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing how that finishes up. But I think where we have to start the focus is really what you've said before, is it's the small distinctions, isn't it? It's the little things that you have to listen into that are going to make the biggest impact.
It's actually quite amazing to listen to highly resourceful technicians talk about how they went about identifying the problem in the first place, like actually confirming what was really happening. Um, Often on a car, what looks like the cause of the problem is in fact the cause of the problem. Um, but those cars where what looks like the problem is in fact a symptom of the problem, is they're the ones that cost the time, cost the money, cause the customer grief, that potentially can result in manufacturers buying cars back from owners because it takes too long, they can't fix it, all those sorts of things, customers' dissatisfaction. And when you listen to the technicians talk about, well, how did you fix it? There's always these really, really small, almost minute things that are the difference that makes the difference. And if you didn't know to track them, if you didn't have the strategy, the internal strategy or the internal tactic to actually go and pursue those things, you would never look for them. Often they're very counterintuitive, and it's all the difference in the world. And we mentioned this with the Viper story earlier. It's 3 words difference between having a car that works and having a car that doesn't. So, yeah, distinctions are critical.
And I think then the distinction that you've also made as well, just in recapping a little bit, is this idea of the difference between the conventional and the unconventional.
Yeah, I'm talking with a room full of technicians not so long ago. The topic of resourcefulness came up. Well, how do we solve these problems? And we touched then on the topic of resourcefulness. And well, how do you get it? So, how do you become resourceful? What are the means or the methods of doing that? And at the moment, there's 2 that I know about. The first one is the conventional way, which is simply by accident. The way we develop our technicians is over 15, 20 years, we give them continuous and ongoing technical training, and gradually over that time, they become not just technically astute, but they become technically resourceful as well. But we don't do the resourcefulness part on purpose. It's just kind of happens somehow, and we've got no idea how it is. Of course, the unconventional way, which probably should be the conventional way but isn't, is actually training people on how to be resourceful, like giving them the tactics and the strategies to develop resourcefulness and to train that, to actually deliver that. It's somewhere about 12 or 14 weeks to teach them the structure of how to do that. But at this point in time, being that it's taking 20 years to get that done, I'd argue that's a bargain as far as the time's concerned.
Yeah, it's a difficult one, isn't it? It's like trying to really get people to understand the real extent of how much value there is in actually trying to develop this at a much greater rate, which is, of course, is what the formula is all about, right?
Absolutely. And resourcefulness, certainly resourcefulness in a workshop is a little bit like oxygen, right? It's not important till you don't have it. And because people have stumbled on this or tripped over it and just over time developed all of these internal methods and internal strategies and tactics to work on cars, to solve faults, to fix problems, because it was less painful to be resourceful than it was to keep getting your butt kicked for getting it wrong. They go about doing that. And so we end up with these really clever, really intelligent people doing brilliant work, but no one has mapped or has a strategy, has a way to be able to capture exactly what these things are. And so if you like, another way to look at resourcefulness is a map for all of the distinctions that you need to be able to track or manage or look for on different faults and different conditions.
And just circling back as well, we spoke previously about the 3 parts of technical resourcefulness. I think it's worth recapping those so we can then just start pulling this apart a little bit further and get people a better understanding of how this formula works.
Sure. So based upon the research that we did over sort of 2.5, 3 years, we were able to tie everything back to 3 gross chunks. And each of these gross chunks has a variety of competencies, and we can dive into those going forward. But the three gross chunks were, the firstly was mindset. That was really important, and more specifically, a quality technical mindset. Everyone runs a mindset, but not everyone runs a quality mindset. And even fewer people in the trade, I think, run a quality technical mindset. The second one was method, and more specifically, a dynamic method. There are lots of different check sheets and processes that are published, and they're great. But being able to do a dynamic method that varies based upon what you find in front of you was absolutely critical to being able to be successful or be resourceful. And the last one was around meaning, and more specifically, it was about mastering meaning. Often in life, as in workshop, meaning is all the difference in the world, and that those tiny distinctions ultimately determine what something means. Does it mean the component is good or bad? At the big end, but we could spend weeks talking about all the different distinctions, and perhaps maybe that's something we could talk about next.
The Frictionless Workshop podcast is brought to you by Solutions Culture. For details on how to get in touch with Andrew, consult the show notes below. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. Now, back to the podcast. Absolutely. I mean, I think what we've got to do is dive into a little bit about meaning, because it's where we started the discussion in many respects, and understanding the data and those small distinctions. But I wanted to, I guess, pull out something that we know we've had some feedback on this in this area. So thanks for people for sending that in, which is fantastic. Heuristics. Talk to me about that a little bit more and explaining it further, because we touched on it in a previous episode, and this is what has been requested, that we delve into that a little bit further, which is obviously attached to meaning.
Oh, absolutely. So the word heuristics comes out of human psychology. I forget the gentleman who developed it or described it originally. It popped up about the 1950s, but it's not a common word that we use in language. You don't see people discussing or comparing heuristics. I'm using this heuristic method. What are you using? We don't sort of see it show up like that. So the definition that they've used was that heuristics are effectively mental shortcuts that allow people to solve problems and make judgments quickly and efficiency. So it's a way of reducing the mental load or the intensity of thinking when we have to either solve a problem or make a decision. Another way to describe heuristics are mental rule of thumb strategies that shorten our decision-making time. And this was one of the things that we found when we did our research. Again, we weren't looking for this. We just wanted to know, well, how are all these gurus being so remarkably successful on these insanely difficult problems? And other people struggle. Like, what is the difference that's making the difference? And we found that the gurus were using what I later found were actually heuristics. And so there's a whole raft of them right throughout the resourceful technician formula.
So let's make this as practical as we can, because there are no doubt there are workshop owner managers we know who are listening in. I mean, the basic starting point is, how do they even know what will work for their people?
Yeah. So with meaning, meaning's really about getting out of overwhelm and getting to order. So that's order, not just on the car that you're working on, but order in your brain so that you can see or visualize or grasp what's happening. And at present, the way heuristics happen is largely through trial and error. I tried this on the last car and it didn't work. And I tried that and this and this, and the third one did. And so now I'm going to try the third one on this car. And eventually people notice a pattern, and some people are faster at that than others. And so that then becomes a strategy or a tactic that they use, that when they see condition A or fault A on a car, they apply tactic or heuristic A to fault A. And usually they're pretty successful. There's often exceptions, but when there's an exception, there's enough evidence to point them what to do next. So as far as the function of meaning, because everyone has data, right? I've said this a lot of times before. Everyone has data. Like there is so much data, it's quite literally overwhelming at times. The issue is about understanding and making meaning from the data. And perhaps the heuristic that we teach that people find the one of the most useful is we call it the FSS as opposed to the FFS. They're two different things. But the FSS is a fast, smart start. So people say work smarter rather than working faster. Well, you can do both. And it's a way of getting started on a fault that if you're not sure where to start, if you're not sure, could it be X, could it be Y, could it be Z, I don't know. Well, we use the heuristic, the fast smart start. And it helps them just get onto the car. And often once they're moving, they're in a position to progress. They're in a position to move forward. One of the other tactics that we teach is we call it the 4 Cs. And when you're dealing with data on anything, there's 4 Cs that you want to be consciously aware of as you're tracking. The first of these is context. What's the context of the data? Because context is critical to meaning. Then what's the actual content? What is the actual number? Because sometimes we talk about, oh, it's about this. Or my favorite is when you ask someone, oh, what's the number? And they give you the all good, and it's like, well, your meter actually comes up with the words saying all good. I don't think so. And so you actually need the number, like what is it specifically? And then, of course,
It's better, Andrew, than if they would respond and say not bad, of course,
not bad,
which
all good is
technically
better than
means the
not bad.
same thing, but it doesn't help, does it?
So what's the number? Oh, not bad, So we have context, we have content, and then we have contrast. Sometimes you need to know what it's not or what the limits are. So you need to have something to compare it to, a contrast. And the last one is the consequence. What's the consequence of that number? If it was to go higher or lower, what are the consequences of that? And so having those 4 Cs to test or to use to analyze your data, context, content, contrast, and consequence are absolutely critical. The other one that we teach, and this will play back into the solution that we found, a solution that this technician found with those 196 fault codes. We call it S3, but he was doing this. He didn't know that it was actually a heuristic that we'd tracked. We call it S3 sorting. And so we talk about when we start looking at fault codes, are they related to the source? Are they related to the symptom? Or are they a separate problem entirely? And he'd actually gone through those 196 codes. Probably took him 10, 15 minutes to do his analysis just on the codes. And he'd worked out which ones were relevant, which ones were related to the source, and which ones were symptoms. And then there was a bunch that just happened to be in there that had no bearing or didn't look like they had any bearing on the actual fault that he was dealing with. And so he was able to tie it down to about 30 different codes, which, like, I don't know about you, but for me, I just go, that's insane that there's 30 codes describing the source. That's just amazing. And then ran a bunch of tests, and he was able to knock this thing over in about an hour and a half. He was able to find the problem, which, when you consider that it was going to take days of diagnostic time just running linear through each fault, starting at the top and working to the bottom, like, that's an amazing result. So again, I point to the fact that why let someone stumble over these heuristics and eventually develop them through trial and error over decades? Wouldn't it make more sense to go, well, why don't we just teach people how to do this? Why don't we give them the heuristics and then teach them how to order them into a structure or a strategy based upon the context of the fault that they're working on? And that's a far better way to do things.
Absolutely. And what I love as well is that there's a whole lot of different approaches to this, right? So different personalities, different levels of where people are at, different kinds of problems. They're going to choose the right heuristic to be able to match that particular problem at any given time.
And that was kind of the ironic thing. They actually have a heuristic for choosing heuristics. which is weird. Like they have a rule of thumb way of going, oh, I think I should use this strategy and not that strategy. And very often they were right. And even when they were wrong, because they had a strategy for choosing heuristics, they just went to the next heuristic. And they hadn't lost a lot of time. Like it wasn't this dive down the rabbit hole, spend 4 hours testing stuff and then going, oh, well, that didn't work. They were able to very quickly go, oh, look, I don't think I'm getting anywhere. I need to shift what I'm doing. And so having someone with these heuristics is what makes them resourceful, or certainly part of what makes them resourceful.
I love all of that. And I know we have to wrap up this episode, and I think that we've got plenty more to unpack in future episodes. But just in finishing up, is there any particular tip that you can give someone who's a low resourceful person, and how do you get them started on being more resourceful?
Yeah, and isn't that the question, right? So the people we've got are the people we've got, and in a perfect world we'd have perfect people, but this isn't a perfect world yet. So there's two things that I want to just comment on very quickly with that. Firstly, is that there are barriers to resourcefulness, because if there wasn't, we'd all have it, right? It would just drop on us from a height, and we'd be fine. And so, as a workshop owner or a workshop manager, perhaps the first question you should be asking is, rather than how do I get resourcefulness for my people, given that at the moment people are getting resourcefulness by accident, perhaps the best question would be to ask, what am I doing that's preventing or slowing my people getting technical resourcefulness? Because the three barriers to resourcefulness or to technical resourcefulness is there's personal barriers, so that relates to the individual themselves. There's environmental barriers, which are the conditions and the items and tools and physical resources that we work with. And then, of course, there's management and procedural barriers. And I've worked in places that just make it so hard for you to be resourceful because of all of the policies, because of all of the stuff and the things that have to be ticked before you can do anything, or limitations on what you can do. So asking that question rather than how do I get resourcefulness, that's important, but perhaps starting with what am I doing that's stopping my people from being resourceful? That alone can unlock an enormous amount of resourcefulness in your team just in and of itself.
Thank you for listening to the Frictionless Workshop podcast. For details on how to get Andrew working with you and your technicians, take a look at the show notes. There's also a link to some special content you can access. I'm Anthony Pearl, reminding you to subscribe so you don't miss an episode.